A warm welcome to all of you tuning in. Today's event, What to Expect from the Philippine Election, is a special collaboration between our Asia Society offices in Manila, New York, and Washington, D.C. I'm Elina Noor, Director, Political-Security Affairs, and Deputy Director of the Washington, D.C. office of the Asia Society Policy Institute. So we're 3 days on from when Filipino voters appear to have elected Ferdinand Marcos Jr. or Bongbong Marcos to be the next president. The vote count is still being finalized, and bear in mind that apart from elections for the highest offices of the land, there are also about 18,000, I think, other positions offered at the ballot box. But with almost all the votes tallied now, Marcos Jr. appears to have the presidency in hand with more than double the votes that his main challenger, Leni Robredo, garnered. So with me from Manila are my good friend, Richard Heydarian, Professor of Political Science at the Polytechnic University of the Philippines, Karen Gomez-Dumpit, who recently completed her term at the Philippine Commission on Human Rights, and Victor Dindo Manhit, CEO and Managing Director of Strat-Based Consultancy. I will just introduce them very briefly, and then we'll go into a conversation before we open it up to your questions and comments. So Richard is Professor of Political Science, as I mentioned, at the Polytechnic University of the Philippines. He is also a frequent and regular commentator in the media. You may have seen him everywhere. And also author of the book, The Rise of Duterte, a populist revolt against elite democracy. Richard has a few other books lined up in the pipeline. He's also taught at De La Salle University and Ateneo de Manila University. We're also grateful to have Victor Dindo Manhit of Strat-Based Consultancy, who's also president of Strat-Base's policy think tank, the Albert Del Rosario Institute for Strategic International Studies. He is also concurrently Philippine country head of Bauer Group Asia. Dindo has held a number of positions in government and was appointed an ASEAN Regional Forum expert and eminent person by the Philippines Department of Foreign Affairs. Importantly for the Asia Society, he's on the board of advisors for Asia Society Philippines. Finally, but certainly not least, we're so thrilled to have Karen Gomez-Dumpit, who recently, as I mentioned, completed her term as a member of the Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines. She served the Philippine government for 32 years, with more than 28 years as an officer of the Commission on Human Rights, 9 years as the first director of the Commission's Child Rights Center, before moving on to the post of Director for Government Linkages, where she served for 13 years before her appointment as Commissioner. So welcome, Karen, Victor, and Richard. Let's get to it. Richard, maybe I can start with you. What are some of the popular misconceptions about Marcos Jr. that you think we should dismantle? What should we better understand about him?
Yeah, you went right for the jugular, huh? Well, it's a long story, but I'll just put it this way. Let's talk about a number of what I call liberal cliches and myths as far as the Philippines political landscape and Ferdinand Marcos Jr. is concerned. Let me start first of all with Ferdinand Marcos, the man of the hour or the moment. A lot of people underestimate him. A lot of people are saying he's just a flunky. He never graduated from any school. Of course, he attended Oxford. He attended Wharton. I don't know how on earth he got into Wharton without graduating from any undergraduate, but it helps to have a dictator father with a lot of funds behind you, right? But this is a guy who was actually got a training in the special forces. He was a hawkish figure towards the end of his father's regime. In fact, he was the last hawk, as one of the Filipino writers, Manolo Quezon, put it. He was calling on his father actually to use much more aggressive means to quell the protest in 1986. Of course, that didn't happen. His father folded at the last moment and eventually the regime fell over. But since then, I think he learned his lesson that what he has to do is show a different side, right? Which is this avuncular, charming, urbane side, very much like his mother, right? Who was the toast of international society. But at the end of the day, he's still a Marcos Jr. I think the fire is there, the ambition is there. And I've been observing him very closely. I attended the final rally of the Marcoses and the Dutertes, I think among very few people who attended both camps, just to make sure I went there. wearing purple, thinking that this is a neutral color between red and pink, but I think it was not neutral enough. So I got a lot of shady looks towards me. Not that threatening, but I did what I do, as shameless as I am. And, this is a guy who is feeling the moment. He's feeling that destiny is with him. And he's the first president to be majority-based as far as post-Marcos dictatorship is concerned. No other president in the Philippines in recent memory has got majority support. We have no runoff election, so it's a single round first past the post. So arguably the last time a Filipino leader got majority-based support in a relatively competitive elections was in 1969. The most violent and fraudulent in Philippine history, at least at the time. But we know a few years later, his father, after becoming the first Filipino president to be re-elected in the post-war period, he declared martial law and essentially established a 2-decade-long reign, right? And a lot of that was, of course, martial law and dictatorship. So I think that parallel is something important to keep in mind. I remember very well in 2010, when former President Aquino won, many people also dismissed him. Oh, he was mediocre. He didn't do much as a senator or as a congressman. He's nothing like his parents, Ninoy Aquino, Corazon Aquino, the heroes of democracy. But guess what? The moment he became the president, he had a sense of destiny, right? And he pushed for aggressive reforms. Now, maybe Bongbong Marcos could be a mirror effect, or who knows? Maybe he could also do something good that will surprise a lot of his critics. As far as liberal cliches are concerned, we hear a lot of our friends, I'm not going to name names, who keep on quoting this ad infinitum rehashed quote from Milan Kundera, right? The struggle between forgetting and like, okay, Philippines is not Soviet-occupied Czechoslovakia. Let's not get over ourselves. I love literature. Let's be clear about it. Yes, disinformation was a factor. But the bigger factor for me is the complete loss of confidence of majority of Filipinos in a dysfunctional democracy. There in the meeting de Avance, the final rally of Marcos and Duterte, I saw people with tears in their eyes. And majority of the people I saw were from the masses. Not the ABC class I saw in the meeting de Avance at the final rally of Robredo in that posh Ayala area, but these were ordinary Filipinos. You can say whatever you want, but you could see in their eyes, they cannot wait another 3, 4, 6 years for gradual reform. They want massive radical change, right? So to dismiss this whole thing as people just being manipulated by disinformation completely forgets the root cause of disaffection of the Filipino people. If you look at the numbers, it's just mind-boggling, and it makes a mockery out of our democratic aspirations. Don't worry, Elina, I'm going to close in soon. For instance, if you look at our Congress, 80% are dominated by political dynasties. If you bring in the out-of-wedlock kids, probably 90%. 40 richest Filipinos on the Forbes list took home 76% of newly created growth. An average Filipino, a median voter, feels no investment in a so-called democracy that the opposition keeps on talking about, or us in the middle class love to talk about. That is the reality on the ground. That's why in the Pew survey, more than 60% of Filipinos from 2017 onwards said they're open to an authoritarian leader. So democratic ambivalence, in my opinion, is a much more important factor than disinformation. So for heaven's sake, let's get out of that myth. And the last myth I want to get rid of is this. There's this myth that this is masses versus the more educated upper class. Forget about it. In 2016, we saw that actually Duterte got more support proportionally among the more well-off Filipinos, ABC, than the DNE, the poorer masses of the Filipinos. In these elections, the gap is even bigger. You're talking about 60%, especially in the case of Sara Duterte and possibly in the case of Marcos. In the case of the Filipino middle class, what they want is order, what they want is discipline, because they're sick and tired of dysfunction, and they suffer from what I call the Singapore envy syndrome. A lot of them go to Singapore, go to United Arab Emirates, go to these authoritarian, prosperous places, and then they say, we want to have this. Forget about freedom, we want success. And you think this is unique to the Philippines? Look at the middle class support of Modi. Look at the middle class support of Bolsonaro. Look at the middle class support behind Erdogan and a lot of authoritarian populist leaders around the world, not to mention Viktor Orban in Hungary. So in a way, the Philippines is both unique and not. And I think it's also very important for us to get rid of these simplistic liberal cliches so that we can have a proper understanding of what on earth is happening in the Philippines and how to save liberal democracy.
Well, Richard, I might have gone for the jugular, but I think you probably severed it. Always can count on you to be provocative. Karen, you're more than welcome to challenge Richard on any of his points, but I wanted to get at your human rights expertise. Obviously, human rights has loomed very large in the background or maybe in the forefront of the Philippines over the last 6 years. It looks likely to continue to be that case, or not, as you're about to tell me. But what can we expect in terms of the human rights landscape moving from Duterte to Marcos Jr.?
Well, definitely, with a Marcos presidency, a second Marcos presidency, we're transported back to how it was during the dark days of the dictatorship and martial law. So a lot of people have been asking me, you have to move on because that was such a long time ago, etc. But then I was saying, how can you tell that to the victims and the families, right? So this is something that has to be addressed, which has not been addressed. A lot of people were saying, oh, but he needs to apologize for that because that was his family. He benefited from that and all that. And we haven't heard any apology yet. So what does this mean in the next 6 years? It's actually opening wounds that have not fully healed. That's the one that's really the most painful, especially for those who have fought for freedom, who have walked and marched in the parliament of the streets. So this is something that's really very painful for them. To ask them to move on is something that is so personal. And this is something that that is awaiting the Marcos presidency. What is he going to do? How is he going to deal with the many thousands of human rights victims under his father's term?
Yes. Well, Richard, Karen has given us kind of a taster of what to expect from a very more personal angle. What can we expect on the political front, given that Marcos Jr. really hasn't had a platform? We've only gleaned a very little from what he said or not said. So what are the guesses in terms of his foreign policy approach?
Well, I mean, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. is actually quite an articulate person if your base is Rodrigo Duterte, the outgoing president. I mean, sometimes I have a hard time just interpreting a single paragraph from President Duterte. No offense to him, but there's like affirmative, ambivalence, and then negation in the same paragraph. So from a discursive analysis point of view, I look forward to watching more or perhaps even talking to the next Filipino president. I think there'll be improvement. We're also going to have less causes against American leaders and all of our friends, and less of infatuation and love for China and all of those authoritarian regimes. So I think there's going to be some changes there. Now, I think on certain fronts, there are going to be some improvements. I think the extrajudicial killing situation could be relatively mitigated under a Marcos regime. It sounds weird, right? But that's how bad things have been, that a Marcos could be even an improvement. That's how bad things have been. Let's not forget, Marcoses are coming in because of Duterte's. I don't think Ferdinand Marcos Jr. could have become the president of the Philippines now or ever had Sara Duterte, the presidential daughter, not withdrawn from the race last year. She was leading all pre-election surveys, getting close to a third of the prospective votes. Bongbong Marcos was only number 3 in some of the surveys. So he's really there because of the Dutertes. They have been the curtain raisers. Nonetheless, Marcos has made it clear that, at least in some of the interviews, he never attended any of the really legit debates, let's just call it that way. But as far as some of the interviews he did, he said that he agrees with the war on drugs, but he wants something that is more rehabilitation focused, more surgical. So even he recognizes that Duterte has been too whiplash. So my sense is, God willing, the situation on the extrajudicial situation will improve, because it has been just catastrophe over the past few years. And I'm sure Karen and the rest will tell you a lot about that. I mean, this has been one of the most painful experiences for me observing the Philippines, seeing people cheering on this bloodletting. So a part of me is cautiously optimistic that will be toned down, although on the surface, Marcos will continue the campaign in whatever form, right? I think on the front of, as I said, foreign policy, there'll be a more calibrated approach also to US and China. I know we'll talk about that more later on. I expect some of the more adults to be there in the cabinet. Our current ambassador to Washington, D.C., Babe Romualdez, a good friend of ours, a very reasonable person, is one of the top candidates, if not a former mentor of mine and professor of mine, Clarita Carlos. So there are a number of names being thrown out there, and they're nothing like, the kind of a pro-China image that people are trying to paint there. Nonetheless, despite all of this, just to close on this, I know we have more to discuss. My fear is, and I think this is really my assessment, the Philippines is in a very clear risk of descending into what political scientists call a hybrid regime, a situation whereby we've seen it in Singapore, we've seen it in Malaysia, but I think we're already seeing it in Hungary, in Turkey, some of the more, let's say, promising democracies not long ago, right? Whereby, yes, you're going to have elections in the Philippines, semi-competitive elections, but we know who's going to be the dominant coalition over and over again, right? And we're already seeing it. I mean, in the past two elections, the opposition just got one of their candidates into the Senate. That's how bad the situation is. In 2019, not a single one. This time, only one. So that tells you how bad and how lopsided the electoral situation is. And it's very likely, and I'm going to close on this note, we can discuss this more, we're going to see constitutional change push very soon. So in his opening act, Marcos has already made it clear he's going to be his own boss. So showing the boss move, he made Sara Duterte take a secondary position, didn't give her the national defense. Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo, former president, who was one of the persons who supposedly mediated this alliance between Duterte's and Marcos's in this election, she's not being given the Speaker of the House. So Marcos is putting his own people he can trust, his family, relatives, Martin Romualdez, his mother is Imelda Romualdez, Marcos, right? Most likely Speaker of the House. And then Cynthia Villar, whose husband is the richest man in the Philippines, also a former Senate president, could be most likely our next Senate president. That trio, that iron triangle, will most likely coordinate some sort of a constitutional change or amendments. And I think that's where things can go very ugly and crazy as far as Philippines is concerned. Defanging Commission on Human Rights, defanging the Presidential Commission on Good Governance, defanging all sorts of, or strengthening counterterrorism laws that actually could be used in so many different ways. So that's where a lot of things can happen. The devil is in the details, but that possibility is definitely over the horizon. So the opposition should get its act together. I know they're grieving. I know they're depressed and all. Well, this is what you get when you rely on questionable indicators. For heaven's sake, Google Trends, is that what your basis is? Surveys are there for a reason. I mean, this is a joke when some of the candidates of opposition are using Google Trends. I mean, this is mind-boggling. They had no real strategy in these elections. Everything was about fairy tale. Well, guess what? That's not how elections work nowadays. But now, nonetheless, Leni mobilized 15 million votes. She expanded her votes from last elections when she ran for vice presidency. That shows she has some sort of upward trajectory. She's inspiring a lot of people who are voting for the first time, a lot of youth, a lot of Gen Z, right? I think if Leni steps up to the plate and really becomes the leader of the opposition that she was not, I'll be just brutally honest about it, in the previous years, I think she can make this, let's say, toddler movement into a very crystallized and robust movement, not only for elections, but also a movement that will put pressure on Marcos and the ruling coalition in terms of their worst instincts. So I'm still cautiously optimistic that the opposition will recover from this loss and will play the long game as it should have always thought of.
Well, Richard, you dropped a number of bombs that maybe we can help trigger and explode a little later on. Before we get to Karen, I just wanted to let everybody know that unfortunately we won't be joined by Dindo Manhit. Some technical problems have prevented him from joining us, regrettably. But we have both Karen and Richard who more than make up for it. And Karen, I saw you smiling a number of times. Let's start with when Richard mentioned that maybe extrajudicial killings will be mitigated under Marcos Jr. Do you agree?
Well, often I've been asked, but the numbers will go down, the killings will go down, etc. No, all throughout the administration of President Duterte. But I always say, that's not something that you will okay and you'll feel good about just because you have less killings today and then in the coming days. It's all about accountability. It's all about how this administration has operated with impunity. No one has ever taken them into account when it comes to the killings and the carnage that has been left by their war on drugs. So I think what to expect, maybe I can modify your question, is what to hope for. in this next administration is, okay, less killings, but there has to be accountability. For all the killings of the past, there has to be accountability for that. But the impression is it's not going to be there. Now, well, Mr. Marcos was saying that, oh, judge me by my actions. So we will see with bated breath if he's going to address this and the past violations, no? Because this is something that really needs to be addressed. Now, on the campaign against criminality, sure, that is a necessary program of any government. And perhaps if I can say expectations or hopes in the coming 6 years, I will say the same thing even if VP Lenny won. I would like to see a gender-balanced cabinet. I want misogynistic language to be erased from the rhetoric of government. I don't want red tagging to continue, and all those accountability mechanisms need to be in place and need to be enabled so that they can fairly say that when they act, they know that the check and balance mechanisms are working. But we already see in this administration that it's not working. So this is something that we were going to monitor as, of course, part of civil society.
But Karen, maybe I can stay with you. And Richard mentioned that he expects for the Commission on Human Rights to be defanged. How can there be accountability if that is going to be the case?
Okay, let me just try to explore that a little more. No, in this administration, you see already consolidation of power with COVID measures. Very militaristic, law enforcement laden measures to quell COVID has actually allowed this administration to consolidate power, because practically, because of restriction of movement, because of acquiring more power, they were able to do that. But even prior to that, this has been something that was explained very well by our chair Chito Gascon, no? Who passed away unfortunately last October last year. And he was saying this is consolidation of power, and you already see and you already expect the legislature to be supermajority. Richard already said that, and it's okay. But you have now virtually a Duterte dominated appointees in the Supreme Court, 13 out of the 15. So where is check and balance there? You have now secondary check and balance mechanisms, the Ombudsman, and then the Commission on Human Rights. And we tried our best to do that. But if a constitutional change will happen, then there is danger in the so many human rights safeguards that is found in the Constitution, including a Commission on Human Rights. But what my advice is, again, this is the same advice whoever would have won the presidency, is that they have to create a transparent process, perhaps a search panel, to be able to choose and give him a list of the next batch of human rights commissioners. If he wants to actually, dispel the impression or the expectation that there's not going to be any accountability in the forthcoming government. So this is something that's really very important. And defanging the commission, I mean, we've been known to be a toothless tiger, a paper tiger. We don't have fangs, but certainly I think we did our best to be able to call out human rights violations and wrongdoings of this government up until the last day of our term.
I love the candor that's going on. Before I turn back to you, Richard, I want to encourage everybody who's tuning in to pose their questions or comments, and we'll get to them shortly. Richard, I want to turn to maybe the flip side, as is often known, of human rights, and that's security issues. The Philippines still has a number of security challenges. Whenever I talk to military personnel in the Philippines, they say the CPP NPA, Communist Philippines Party, and the New People's Army are still a simmering threat and challenge to the security landscape of the Philippines. You also have some of the challenges in the southern part of the Philippines. So what will Marcos Jr.'s presidency mean for the domestic security landscape in the Philippines?
Right. Well, I mean, definitely there is that temptation because the playbook is already there, right? Duterte used the pandemic to securitize the situation. And also, he has used the paranoia around communists supposedly taking over the country or terrorists taking over the country to also consolidate power. So unfortunately, the presidency is fresh. It's not even from his father 50, 40 years ago. It's just from the outgoing President Duterte. That's why the situation is very, very fragile. That's why the opposition, the stakes were very high. That's why I call this election the most consequential, right? Now, as perhaps unfavorable as things are, it also depends who will be the next defense secretary. My understanding is that current Defense Secretary Lorenzana, who's also from Mindanao, who has supported the peace process in Mindanao, will perhaps stick around for a while until Gibo Chodoro, one of the candidates who lost, can take over next year because there's a restriction of 1 year for losing candidates. And Gibo Chodoro actually was also a defense secretary back in the day during the Arroyo administration, a relatively level-headed guy, a cousin of former President Aquino. So hopefully the transition from Lorenzana to Gibo or whoever is going to come next will be good enough so that there's a sense of basic compassion for Mindanao. Because one of the things I noticed, I went to Marawi also a few years after the conflict, just before the pandemic hit, and their construction was horrible. Not much was happened. But always what they say is that they blame the Manila people for lack of it. They say at least Duterte is one of us. He understands us. He has compassion for us, right? So I think it's very important that the Marcos administration signals to folks in Mindanao, especially the Moro Islamic Liberation Front leadership, who, by the way, supported Leni, even though surveys were saying Leni's going to lose. I think they were so worried with the Marcos return because of the horrible things that happened during dictatorship that they still went for Leni. That was really a leap of faith. That was a very, very courageous thing for them to do, right? So I think that was almost a spiritual act for them. And now, of course, the fear is maybe Marcos will be retributive. But I think if he puts the right persons in charge of national security, of the defense ministry and all, we may have a much more reasonable approach. And my sense also with dealing with the armed forces of the Philippines, I give a lot of lectures there, I deal with folks there on South China Sea issue, among others, is that they're also tired of war. They understand that we have to transition elsewhere, especially the Philippine Navy and Air Force, who are sick and tired of seeing all the budget going to the ground forces. The Army has to get still something, an excuse, right? But I think the excuse shouldn't be as big as another war in Mindanao. So I think my worry more there is not necessarily an outbreak of major conflict again, but more of not investing in the process of transition enough. Because in the past, we had the transition to autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao, but there was no capacity building. And the elite who were in charge there, they had no background in actual governance. I mean, Nur Musuari and all were perhaps the Che Guevaras of their people, but they were not necessarily FDRs, right, when it comes to governance. So this is one of the worries we have, that even though the peace process has been moving in the right direction, the governance parts, if it doesn't get enough fiscal support, political support from Marcos administration, and especially key people in charge, national security, defense secretary, the peace process secretary, etc., then we could be in trouble. Now, I'm going to hold back judgment because I'm still going to wait for the final cabinet to come out. So I don't want to preempt this. But yes, I am a little bit worried because I'm not sure if Bongbong Marcos has the kind of, let's say, at least basic compassion and understanding for issues in Mindanao, in Muslim Mindanao, the way that Duterte had. I have many reservations with Duterte, but I don't question his intention. I think he genuinely cares for people in Mindanao and even our Muslim brothers and sisters. Now, competence management is another issue that unfortunately was not there with him. So I have that worry, but I think if the right deputies are put there, we can move in the right direction. Now, on the front of the communists, it's quite a different picture because the communist movement has been fragmented for a while. We're not very clear who's really the leadership. There was a flirtation by Duterte towards the communists. The ideologue of the communist movement in the Philippines was a former professor of Duterte when he studied back in the day. So in Lyceum, sorry, not San Beda, in Lyceum, when he studied back in the day. But it pettered out. It didn't work out because there's no center of gravity. Now, the fear now, though, is that both sides are going to benefit from each other, right? Because the communists, they love having a Marcos there because it gives them the kind of raison d'etre, right? They get the enemy they're looking for, right? At the same time, the Marcoses, may also want to have the communists around so that it can be easy for them to tag any oppositionist with some progressive ideas as potentially just a front for the. So I think it's much more compartmentalized. Probably the situation is going to be slightly more reasonable when dealing with MILF and the Muslim Mindanao issue. On the communist front, I'm less optimistic, but I'm sure Karen and other folks who have been involved in the peace process could tell me more. But I've written a lot on this. I've dealt with folks from Norway, among others. I'm not sure we can be very optimistic on this front. But then again, there's always the crazy outside possibility that the son will try to pull off something to kind of make up for everything, right? I mean, everyone made fun of Napoleon III, right, when he essentially won riding on his uncle's name, right? But look at today's Paris and how beautiful it is. These are all Haussmann projects. And guess who appointed Haussmann? It was Napoleon III. So I don't know. Maybe, yes, first as tragedy, then as farce, but maybe the farce in this time will work in the right direction. So I'm still going to withhold judgment. But yes, I'm quite worried on the communist front, perhaps not as much on the BARM front. But on both fronts, I think I'm going to be overall still worried about the direction of this administration.
Yeah, Richard, you mentioned the MILF's explicit endorsement of VP Robredo, but also some BARMM governors came out in support of Marcos Jr. So is there kind of a division on the ground in terms of political support, and how do you think that's going to play out under Marcos Jr.?
Yeah, obviously it's not monolithic, right? Obviously it's not monolithic. There are tribal competitions there. There are local dynasties and warlords there. So I think the idea of us presupposing that one family or one group controls everything is completely nonsensical, right? And I think a lot of other local government officials were just looking at their political future and survival. I mean, all the surveys were saying it's going to be a landslide. It is a landslide. So a lot of these people wanted to just survive. So perhaps they voted for Marcos Sara because they felt that this is the most reasonable they can do under the current circumstances. I don't think it necessarily means they completely believe in Marcos, but they should hope that that support, right, will translate into some sort of channels of communication. Because I think if you look at some of the numbers, the ratio is like 8-2. That's how big it went for Marcos, thanks to Sara. So maybe Marcos will feel happy a little bit about the situation there. Probably if it went the reverse, there could be retribution. But it didn't happen that way. So I'm more concerned about what happens with the MILF because they openly came out and support. I thought they're going to stay neutral or not going to say anything. So it was really touching to see them making that risky leap of faith. But I can understand also where they're coming from. Let's just hope that doesn't backfire in the wrong way for both sides, right? And the other thing worry I have is that maybe Bobo Marcos and people in his cabinet are the more adult-ish people, but we have some wackos here and there, right? Who would want to whack, they're the tails that want to whack the dog. So I'm watching out for some of these bloggers, some of these almost proto-fascist, right? Ideologues out there who are not in the inner circle of Marcos, but are riding on this pro-Marcos, pro-Duterte ideology and wave to push their own more extreme far-right kind of agenda. They haven't been as influential in the past years, but I don't know. You have 6 years of Duterte, another 6 years of Marcos. It might embolden some people a tad too much. So I'm not going to underestimate that. And that's another thing that I'm going to watch out for.
Great. I mean, Karen, you, with your considerable experience in the commission, what do you think are the likely prospects for peace in Muslim Mindanao?
Well, of course, I think rehabilitation is really one of the things that they need to concentrate on, especially in Marawi. And also addressing the displacement in the area, because right now infrastructure is not there. People have not fully returned to the area. There have been talks that they cannot anymore return, obviously, because the military wouldn't want them to return. All these things, no? But of course, from a human rights perspective, we're looking at the impact that it has brought to the community. Now, when it comes to CPP-NPA, I think the peace talks should resume. This is something that perhaps can pave the way for better, let's say, the situation on the ground when it comes to communities that are caught in the crossfire. This is something that's really, really, I think, very much needed. But when it comes to perhaps concern about Mindanao, then yes, I would agree with Richard that let's wait and let's see. Because, you know, the main, if there's one word that they have overused in this campaign is really unity. So let's see how that unfolds in the coming administration. If they would be vengeful, they would retaliate politically. But, you know, there's also what you call a honeymoon period. There's also a saying that everybody loves a winner. So let's see how it unfolds. No, I don't know what the prediction is when it comes to constitutional change, but perhaps federalism will have a front and center, attention when it comes to constitutional change. But this is something that we're trying to guard against. We're hoping that there will be non-negotiables if this is going to be pursued by the next administration. And we hope that human rights safeguards will remain in place and will even be strengthened. Now, I'll just round up with one more. No? A diplomat was telling me, but you know, Karen, he's different from his father. And I think one of the main goals of his presidency is trying to resurrect and clean the name of the Marcoses. And maybe he will do good. Well, let's wait and see, no? Because that can also be possible. And if that's possible, then we have a whole list to give him so that he can actually do good in a position that he was reposed with given the election results.
Yeah, Elina, can I just say something? Yeah, I forgot to say. By the way, thank you to Karen for mentioning the unity motherhood statement, which can mean anything to anyone. But I think people are so sick and tired of dysfunction. Even motherhood statements like unity kind of appeal to them. And Marcos personally actually didn't attack anyone. So he kind of outsourced that. Very good job. Not to mention his BTS look, K-pop look on TikTok and all of that, which did wonders for him among Gen Z voters. Although millennials, we didn't vote that much for him back in 2016. I mean, my generation, not necessarily me. Of course, I'm non-partisan. But one person we have to mention who topped the Senate race, it matters who tops the Senate race, right? Because people who tend to top the Senate race have another different kind of profile. They can run for presidency and others. Is Robin Padilla, a convert to Islam, right? He actually comes from the same town I come from the north. We speak Ilocano, the same language as the Marcoses. So he's a convert to Islam. So he's one of the few Muslims who has made it to the Senate in recent memory. I think the first Muslim in decades in the Philippine Senate. And the issue of federalism, which is a vague thing again, for me, I think it's more autonomy and respect for Muslim brothers and sisters is very close to his heart in a very sincere way for Mr. Robin Padilla. And I think Robin Padilla will have certain degree of access and ease with this administration. Of course, Sara Duterte, because they're both from Mindanao, but probably even with the Marcos. So I'm hoping that some people with Robin Padilla who are going to have a prominent position in the Senate, right, will pick up the cudgels, right, for Muslim brothers and sisters because they're not really properly represented. And they will act as that kind of transmission belt for the right kind of initiative and approach to this issue. So that's why I'm saying there are also some key figures to look at. And Robin Padilla, in my opinion, could be one of those figures, even though everyone underestimates him because he has no relevant background in governance, didn't graduate, etc. But that mattered, right? For someone can even become president by just attending Oxford for 2 semesters, right? Okay, so let's put it that way.
We have a number of questions already coming in through social media. One of the questions, let's stay on the domestic front before we segue into foreign policy with a little more detail. So one of the questions that came in was, what about the impact of young voters? Many may not remember the elder Marcos and martial law and all the atrocities during that time. Has the segment of the young voter population made an impact, and what continuing impact will it make?
Can I answer as a millennial? Sorry, I'm sure Karen has her own youth bashing to do. No, I'm kidding. No, there's a lot of millennial bashing in the past. But actually, if you look at the exit polls and numbers, millennials were more behind Leni Robredo and other candidates than Marcos. In fact, I think the big reason why Leni won that razor-thin margin in 2016 is because of millennials. Marcos had more support among the older people, our boomer friends, no offense, right? And that's where I'm saying nostalgia is a big problem. It's not necessarily lack of historical memory or education. A lot of people were there, they saw it, but now suddenly they're romanticizing the past. Like, oh, they're disappointed with the present, they romanticize the past. We know what poison nostalgia can become. But this election is different, and that's where strategy comes in. Marcos says, lost that race. Of course, they never accepted it, but they went back to the drawing board. So very consciously, Marcos really targeted the youth in these elections, especially Gen Z, the next generation. Now, I don't want to bash the next generation, but their TikTok strategy just did wonders. I mean, if you look at the TikTok and vlogs of, because one of the things I do, among others, is being a vlogger, by the way, my latest, I'm very active on social media because I mean, most likely my next president will announce his next big initiative on his vlogs, so I'm really watching, and there you can see it. I mean, the guy is he looks like a BTS star, right? His hair is like BTS. He has V-cut shirt, bomber, cool factor. So they clearly, whatever analytics team they got, their Swiss analytics, Oxford analytics, they really focus on getting the Gen Z to their side. And for the Gen Z, this was bandwagoning. Who's the coolest candidate? Let's go with the winner. I think that was the overwhelming tendency, and I think numbers will show. I think some of the numbers we have pre-election surveys that his biggest support base is actually the youngest voters, right? And I think this election is different. So I don't think we should judge the Filipino youth per se, but this election, we had a very radically different outcome than the previous one, which tells you the opposition had some strategic problem. I think they took it for granted that, essentially they left. I mean, you go to YouTube, you will find no influencer from the opposition side with comparable support. The other side, I mean, they have this bunch of people like they just do their jazz and they have 1 million followers and millions of views. I mean, they just do no script, whatever. It's crazy, but it works. It works. And they left the field to the enemy, and the chickens are coming home to roost.
Karen, are you on TikTok, or do you have a vlog like Richard?
No, I don't. Maybe I'll take it up someday. The only social media that I don't have is really TikTok. I haven't really ventured into that. But I'm a Gen Xer, so well, of course, no. The youth that I know, not only millennials but even younger, are actually Lenny. So maybe I have an echo chamber. But I agree with you. But let me just say that that's where this information was really directed at. It wasn't the old ones. The old ones were, you're correct. It was the nostalgia of it all. The memory of the good times. But then we all know that it's not really the golden age, no, based on facts. But this is something that I think is really very crucial, because we need to still address disinformation and fake news. This is something that we need to really address this time. And then just to say that the opposition is not really solid anyway. That's the reason why. The campaign of VP Lenny was really just like that, but it turned out it was a good start, and a lot of people are saying maybe timing, or the period of time within which they were able to launch that campaign should have been done early on, so that it could have been a really good fight. So this information is something that is still crucial. We need to ensure that this is addressed in the next administration, but also this is addressed by the social media giants, because this is something that can really make or break the next 6 years, actually, for everybody in the Philippines, no? And for other countries for that matter.
Karen, this is a specific question about how stable and independent is the Commission's Secretariat and Executive Director, as distinct from the appointed commissioners and chairperson.
All right. Thank you for that question. It really gives me an opportunity to be able to speak about the very able directorate that we have left in the Fifth Commission. They are civil servants, but they are actually technocrats in terms of human rights. And, as an institution, as a national human rights institution, we are also accredited. In fact, our accreditation will be coming in March. So next year. And if it is shown that the next batch of commissioners will not live up or will not be able to exercise independence from this government, then that's something that will affect the accreditation of the Commission as a national human rights institution. And that accreditation is also a grade of any government. They have to enable an independent national human rights institution. Now, having said that, just to say that again, as I said this at the beginning, that we will judge and we will call out and we will monitor any government, whoever is sitting there, based on human rights standards and principles. So whatever the commission should be saying, the next batch of commissioners should be saying, will always be anchored on human rights standards and principles and the obligation of the state to be able to protect, promote, and fulfill human rights. I'd like to just say this as well. No? I'm going back to accountability. If we do not see it at the domestic level, at least just to say that, all check and balance mechanisms, except, of course, for the legislature, you already heard in the judiciary, you already know that constitutional commissions, all appointed by President Duterte. And then with the passing of Chair Chito, there was an appointment, but it was amongst us. But a Duterte appointee nevertheless. But right now, the only check and balance mechanism that this incoming president will appoint is the Commission on Human Rights. So he better make it good. It's a litmus test for him to be able to enable accountability for his governance. But then you also have accountability mechanisms outside the Philippines. And we're talking about the United Nations. We will be reviewed under Universal Periodic Review of the Human Rights Council. This is going to be in October, I believe, or November. You also have the review of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as well as the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. These are international commitments that you cannot say, oh, I cannot be reviewed by that. And then, of course, you also have the recent commitment of the Philippine government on the UN Joint Program on Human Rights. And that will again be another test for this administration in terms of human rights governance.
Great. We started a few minutes late, so I hope with your indulgence, we can end a few minutes after the hour, because there are obviously questions about foreign policy. So Richard, what's it going to be for the Philippines, the US or China?
Right. I mean, let's call it I don't want to use the word cliche, but the common wisdom is that we have another Duterte, essentially, as far as foreign policy is concerned, that Marcos is pro-China and Philippines down a hopeless path, and my goodness, we're going to be a province of China down the road. I think that's very simplistic, misses a lot of important points, including hundreds of articles I've written, book I've written on this issue. Okay, let me put it this way. Whoever becomes the Philippine president, on China, they'll face two structural constraints. Number one, the Philippine defense establishment. Lots of people there, including the current defense secretary, are graduates of West Point, graduates of New South Wales, or sometimes both, right? A lot of them have a lot of exposure to the West, right? Now, that doesn't make them pro-American per se. I think that misses the point. But that makes them institutionally embedded in that alliance. Effectively, it makes them veto players in favor of maintaining that alliance. What's the proof? The proof is that Duterte was not able to do anything major as far as undermining our defense agreements with the US is concerned. It's not for the lack of trying. He tried right and left, but he got pushed back right and left, not only from the defense side, from the foreign ministry side, over and over and again. And that explains why the foundation of our alliance are there. That explains why we had 300 joint military activities scheduled for this year, the most between US and any Indo-Pacific partner. Now, Could the relationship be better? Yes. That's why the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement is very important. But some of the information we're getting is that even that is moving in the right direction because of the lobbying of the military and the defense establishment. If you go to one of my op-eds in New York Times, as early as 2017, I said, this is not Duterte's personal army. And that argument has stood by and large. So I totally do not buy this argument that Duterte bought the military and the military is China's thing. The fact that the Philippines did not finalize a single defense agreement with China, or even Russia for that matter, right, tells you a lot. Again, it's not for the lack of trying. Believe me, there was an effort. It just didn't work. There was veto, there was pushback. I believe that tendency will stick, especially if some of the people I expect will be in positions of key positions like Department of National Defense and Foreign Affairs in the coming years. Again, let's see. Sara Duterte wanted to be in the Department of National Defense. That kind of raised eyebrows like, what's going on? Sorry, didn't happen. It's not happening. I'm sorry, okay? Do your Department of Education. We have also issues with that, obviously, history, text. But at least they're away from those key positions. That's good. The second thing is public opinion. I think I have a copyright claim to a number of terms I've used, including Duterte-garks, Duterte's oligarchs. So now it's becoming a term used by a lot of people analyzing these billionaires coming out of nowhere during Duterte and now going back below. You can guess who are these people. But the other thing is pledge trap. You see, debt trap never happened in the Philippines because unlike Malaysia and a lot of our friends, Sri Lanka among others, there wasn't even much of an investment to begin with. China took Duterte for a ride. You know, this is the problem when you put a former provincial mayor with zero experience in geopolitics but a big mouth in charge of a very important country, right? And he was taken for a ride. Up until today, not a single big-ticket infrastructure investment by China is kicked off in any meaningful way. And the situation in the South China Sea, guess what? It's even worse than when Duterte came. More militarization, more militiaization. The Chinese militias have been doing all sorts of shenanigans right and left, including allegedly sinking one of our fishing boats back in 2019 in Reed Bank, which pissed off everyone. China's net trust rating is negative 30.
Yes.
At best. US is plus 70. Now, good luck with Bongbong Marcos ignoring all of that. And brings me to the number 3 factor, which brings me actually to the very question you raised. What should we know about Marcos? Yes, Marcoses have court cases in the US. Yes, he wanted the Reagan administration to stick by them. Yes, they're annoyed with all of these US court cases and all. But let's get into this. First of all, the issue of travel restrictions could be resolved the same way that Narendra Modi was suddenly allowed to go to America. Remember, Narendra Modi had issues with the pogroms in Gujarat in early 2000s. I know all of these people because I had to analyze Duterte. But what did the State Department do? They tweaked it so Narendra Modi goes there and have a swell time with Trump. So I don't think that will be a big issue for Marcoses. He will have sovereign immunity, right, as the head of a state. Yes. I don't think that's going to be a big issue. Sorry to the opposition. They're excited about that. No, it's not going to happen. This is geopolitics. This is an adult's game. Now, the other thing we have to keep in mind is this. The Marcoses never had lifelong resentment against the West. If anything, they are the products of the West, right? Bongbong Marcos did boarding school in England. He attended in Oxford. He went to Wharton. Yes, he didn't graduate from any of them as far as we know. But he is an aficionado of British underground culture and music. I have my friends, my culturati friends are saying, this guy is a geek. He knows these underground bands in UK that even people in London don't know about. His son, I think, studied in Eton and a graduate of London School of Economics, right? His wife, I think, claims to have passed the bar so she can be a practicing attorney in New York. Amy Marcos, Imelda Marcos, they were the toast of the town, the Kennedys. They are not infatuated with Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping the same way that Duterte was. Duterte was never part of the global elite. He barely had any exposure to the US and the West. I think once he tried to go through the US, I think they didn't allow him to get in for some visa issues, pissed off at the Americans. So Marcoses are a completely different political ball game, as far as this is concerned. So the room for engagement is immense. Duterte has stood by one word, at least he said, which is he will not go to any Western capital during his term. Guess what? He didn't. Even the US-ASEAN summit, Duterte, nada, zilch, I'm not going. In fairness to him, he stood by some few words he made. But Marcos would love affirmation. They would love to get love. I'm sure they would love to go to the Buckingham Palace. They feel like royalties of the Philippines. There'll be an Asia-ASEAN summit later this year in Brussels. Marcos would love to go there to have some hobnobbing with the royalties. Hey, we're back. You know, I think Imelda would want to make a move. All I'm saying is this. This is Tiffany & Co., right? This is the Philippine old new rich back in power. So dealing with them will be very, very different with Duterte's. So people are saying this is just going to be another Duterte. They have no idea what they're talking about. Of course, there's a risk that some dodgy investments from China can come in, some flirtation will happen. But to say this is set in stone, you don't know what you're talking about. So that means there's a challenge here for the Biden administration, for our Western partners to engage. Nudge the Marcos administration to respect human rights, good governance, but at the same time, make sure to provide us alternatives, a digital free trade, a bilateral free trade, solidifying our defense agreements, helping, by the way, civil society. I know everyone in the West knows about Maria Ressa and Rappler. Well, guess what? They're just one of thousands who have been sacrificing here. They're not the only one, right, who are getting trolls and death threats and all. And by the way, Rappler is not even one of the major outlets in the Philippines in terms of reach. So please, you in the West, support ordinary journalists, ordinary, not so known channels abroad who actually are doing a lot of job. I have young colleagues who have been covering extrajudicial killing cases. They have post-traumatic stress disorder. They never got any recognition because all the recognition just goes to one person and one organization in the Philippines. I'm sorry to say it, but this is not the best way to encourage the civil society in the Philippines. You have to recognize the sacrifices of a lot of people, including a senator of the Republic who has been languishing in the jail for the past 5 years. I believe she should have been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Senator Leila de Lima. I'll keep it there. I'm getting a little bit emotional about this, but this is something very close to my heart. And I'm telling you, the game is not over. We withstood the worst instincts of Duterte. We can still do well. And I think Bongo Marcos could be just right person to try to kind of vindicate his family in some way or another. And as I said, they're a product of the West. They would love affirmation and engagement. So do the right kind, not enable their worst instincts, but nudge them in the right direction. And I'm still cautiously optimistic something can be done on that front.
I would never have guessed that you were getting emotional, Richard, but I always appreciate your passion. Karen, as you know, the US administration under Biden has prioritized human rights. And so this, again, is a shadow that looms over the incoming presidency of Bongbong Marcos. Anything you'd like to weigh in on what Richard has already said and kind of this human rights dimension to how foreign policy is going to be conducted under Bongbong?
Well, I completely agree with Richard. No? Again, on the issue of Leila de Lima, I think a low-lying fruit there is stop it. Stop the charge because that's really an invented charge. No? That could be very symbolic of his one-word campaign, unity. That's one. Second, perhaps, is try to, whether he likes it or not, like not the US, but let's look at EU, the GSP Plus, the General Scheme of Preference Plus, where we have committed when we applied to follow the human rights treaties and conventions, including International Labor Organization conventions. And to be able to follow that, then he must go into a path that's quite different from what this administration has been doing. Death penalty, I think, is off the table, thank God. He did say that already as much. I hope he continues to do that. And then, of course, I completely agree that there has to be a widening or at least the shrinking civic space in the country must be addressed by the next administration. And how is he going to do that? Then perhaps take a look at trying to get ABS-CBN back or dropping, of course, the charges also against Maria Ressa and Rappler. And also, I completely agree that it's the community-based human rights defenders, journalists who are actually the one that is who are most in danger. Again, as Maria Ressa says, she's very lucky because she's very prominent. She's popular. But then what about those who hold the line at the community level? And this is something that I think any administration, any presumptive president should be able to undertake. Low-lying fruits that would actually illustrate demonstrate that indeed his intention is to unite the country. But of course, accountability must be there and it has to be in place because no unity can happen without widening access to justice and without getting a measure of justice for the victims of the past and the recent past.
Well, we've covered an immense number of issues on both Philippines' domestic politics as well as foreign policy with incredible breadth and depth, and could not have done it, obviously, without Richard and Karen. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and for doing so with such candor. That's always appreciated here at the Asia Society. I also want to thank all of you for your active interaction and questions. Sorry again that we could not have had Dindo on this event with us today, but hopefully we can have him and Richard and Karen. I know this is your first time with us, but definitely not the last time. So we hope to have you back. The dust has only just begun to settle with the Philippines elections, but nowhere close to being settled, right, with the Marcos Jr. presidency. So stay tuned, and we hope to have both Richard, Karen, and hopefully Dindo back again to unpack more of this saga. Thank you all again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elina. Thank you, Karen.